Hello again, everyone. BBD here for another Versus video. This time we get to play some Legacy, which I'm always excited to play. I personally love Legacy a lot more than actually any other format, so I'm always excited to play some Legacy, and I like this deck a lot. I played it at the last Open I played in. I've made some changes since then, but basically it is Deathblade, which is pretty much just Stoneblade, but with Deathrite Shaman. Who really does a lot to help the deck out. So pretty excited to jump in on this deck. And today, also a little different, I'm going to be playing against Josh Cho, someone I have never played against in a playtest video. And although I have played against him a few times in events, and he has pretty much crushed me every time. So see if we can change that a little bit today. But I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the cards in this Deathblade deck and why I think it's worth playing. I'm going to jump in on the mana base here. 23 lands. I know a lot of Stoneblade lists like to play 22. I've always personally advocated playing 24, but with Deathrite Shaman, I think you can afford to trim one. And the reason you want to play enough lands like 23 or 24 is because unlike other decks in Legacy, you actually just want to hit almost all your land drops in this deck. You have cards like Jace, you have cards like Batterskull, which you oftentimes have to hardcast. Even things like play an Umazaw's Jit and equip it in the same turn requires 4 mana. You want to make sure that you're hitting your land drops so you can play all these spells. Like Snapcaster Mage as well. If you're going to snap back something like a counter spell, that's also 4 mana. It's just important in a deck like this to hit your land drops. And since we have 2 Wastelands, even if we flood out a little bit, we usually still have something we can do with our mana. Same with Creeping Tar Pit. Much like almost any other deck in Legacy, we have the fetches and the dual lands that we can search up any of these dual lands with any of these fetches, with the exception Marsh Flats doesn't get Tropical Island. And the reason to play a Tropical Island is basically just for Deathrite Shaman's green ability. It doesn't come up that often, but it's worth having at least one way to be able to do that in your deck. And since we can fetch the Tropical Island with these 8 fetch lands, it's usually pretty easy to be able to get it when we need it. 3 basics. Now, normally my philosophy on Legacy is I don't really care if my opponent wasteland me, and I want to make sure my mana base is as good as possible. But in a deck like Stoneblade, I actually do like running basic lands because unlike some other decks, I actually do want to hit all my land drops, like I said. And sometimes you do want to fetch a basic to make sure that you can hit the 4 mana you need to play Jace. Wasteland is not normally a great card in a deck like Stoneblade, but I actually think it's really good here because anytime I'm playing a deck with Deathrite Shaman, I pretty much always want access to Wasteland in my deck. The ability to go something like turn 1 Deathrite Shaman, turn 2 Wasteland them, and play a 2-drop is just like, it just sets you so far ahead. Not only do you have a 2-drop and a Deathrite Shaman in play, but if you're on the play, your opponent now has 0 lands in play. And it's just like, usually it's very hard to lose games like that. So I think having access to Wasteland in a Deathrite deck is like something I don't want to play Deathrite decks without Wasteland, basically. Karakas, we don't have any legends in our own deck, except we have a couple Vendilion Clicks in the sideboard. But Karakas is a great answer to like the show and tell decks. You can bounce their Gristlebrand's or their Emrakul's, and it can be good against like opposing Vendilion Clicks. And there's a surprising amount of legends that see play in Legacy from time to time you'll be able to get value out of Karakas that you would never have expected. I've been able to bounce even stuff like Krenko against the Goblin deck that you just wouldn't expect Karakas to come into play against that deck. And Creeping Tar Pit, I love this card in Legacy. It doesn't see a lot of play, but I almost want to play a second copy in this deck because it's so good. One of the awesome things about Deathrite Shaman is it does a lot of incidental damage to your opponent. At the end of each turn, if you can like activate it to exile an instant or sorcery and do 2 damage to them, that adds up. And Creeping Tar Pit is a great way to like capitalize on that and really finish the game out. But that's the mana base. Here are the creatures in this deck. We have 4 Deathrite Shaman, as I said. This card is just amazing in Legacy. I know I've talked about it in other Legacy videos I've done, but it really does everything. It can gain you some life. It really keeps your opponent's graveyard in check, which is important against a lot of different graveyard strategies. Can turn off your opponent's Snapcaster Mages. It can turn off like their Tarmogoyfs. It does so much. And it also, the main thing is with fetch lands, it accelerates you. It lets you do things like play turn 2 Liliana of the Veil, turn 3 Jace, the Mind Sculptor, plays that are just backbreaking against a lot of decks in Legacy. Dark Confidant is a card that I played 2 copies of when I last played this deck. It was amazing for me every time I cast it. I decided I just wanted to play 4 copies this time, see how that goes. Dark Confidant that card is just so good in Legacy. I think it's a lot better in Legacy than it is in Modern, mainly because a lot of decks don't have ways to kill it, so it stays in play. And the longer it stays in play, the more advantage you're going to gain from it. And even decks that do have a way to kill it, between Deathrite Shaman, Dark Confidant, and Stoneforge Mystic, we have so many different creatures that demand an instant removal spell that we can sometimes overload their removal spells. Stoneforge is kind of the namesake creature in this deck. Provides the blade and the Deathblade. Stoneforge is pretty much a staple of Legacy at this point. Fetches Batterskull and Jet. Oftentimes, decks have something like a Sword of Fire and Ice or a Feast and Famine in the sideboard as well. Having access to Stoneforge just really it's a 2-mana Baneslayer Angel a lot of the time. And even if they kill your Stoneforge Mystic so you can't cast like the Jet or the Batterskull off it, you can still just hard cast a Batterskull on turn 5, or you can use Brainstorm to shuffle the Batterskull back for like another Stoneforge Mystic, or shuffle it back just for an extra card. So Stoneforge is still going to generate an advantage for you, even if it dies on the spot. And then Snapcaster Mage. Previously, I would play no less than 4 Snapcaster Mages, and old Stoneforge decks, I actually thought Snapcaster Mage was just the best card in the deck, even besides stuff like Stoneforge Mystic or Jace the Mind Sculptor. But Legacy's kind of changed a bit with Deathrite Shaman, and Snapcaster's not quite as good anymore because opposing Deathrite Shamans can hinder his ability to effectively flashback cards in your graveyard. So I still want 3 copies, and I still have a 4th on the board for matchups where he's really good, but he's definitely not quite as powerful as he once was. As for the spells that Snapcaster can flashback, we have 5 discard spells. These are very important against any of the combo decks, but they're also good against a lot of the fair decks too. So I think these cards have gone up a lot, their stock in Legacy, over the last few months, and one of the main reasons to even play a deck like this is the ability to cast these cards and then Snapcaster them back. For Brainstorm, I don't think I need to really go into too much detail here. This is arguably the best card in Legacy. Allows you to shuffle Chaff back. It allows you to hit your land drops if you're missing those, etc. 4 Swords of Plowshares, just the best control removal spell in Legacy. Kills anything, costs just 1 mana, and it doesn't really matter if your opponent gains some life. Ponder's just another Brainstorm effect. This could be a 24th land, but sometimes it's nice to have a Ponder to give you a little bit more options. A single counterspell. When I played this deck before, I did not have any counters in the main deck, and I lost a few games that I would have won if I had just access to even 1 to dig for. So I think it's worth having one of these, especially with Snapcaster Mage. It's often 2. And then Liliana and Jace. Jace is an extremely powerful card. I would play 4 copies, except you usually don't need the 4th. And then Liliana is very powerful as well against almost any deck in Legacy. Her discard ability is great against the combo decks, and her Edict ability is great against pretty much every other deck. So this is the Deathblade main deck. I'm now going to talk a little bit about the sideboard. All right, so our sideboard has a number of different cards that we want to bring in, like in some different matchups. First of all, we have like Supreme Verdict, Vindicate, and Path to Exile. Vindicate comes in against a lot of different decks, like even like some of the Miracle decks, or decks where you really need to answer some problematic permanents, but it also comes into play against like some of the aggressive decks where you just want to destroy something. And Path to Exile and Supreme Verdict are mostly for any kind of creature matchup, like Rug Delver, or like we're going to be bringing these in today against Cho's Merfolk deck, or like like a Maverick deck or an Elves deck or anything like that. That's where you want these cards, and you're going to want to cut some of the, usually like when you bring in cards like this, you want to cut some of the more expensive stuff. Like Jace isn't necessarily always the best against decks like that. If they're faster, then you have a chance to play the Jace. or like your counter spell is not going to be good against decks like that. So those are the kinds of cards you usually want to side out when you bring in these. We have Force of Will, Vendilion Click, Counterspell. This is kind of our anti-combo package, along with Snapcaster Mage and Thoughtseize. These cards are all super disruptive against the combo decks. Between Discard, Snapcaster Mage, Counterspells, Hand Disruption, and an Evasive Threat, it's just very difficult for combo decks to beat this deck post-board. You just have so many answers and so many ways to shut them down. And usually when you bring in cards like this, you're going to want to cut stuff like Swords to Plowshares, which are bad against most combo decks, or just any kind of other like removal spells like that. I often also cut the Stoneforge Mystic package sometimes, which may sound surprising, but a turn 3 4/4 is actually pretty slow against a lot of combo decks. So Stoneforge actually isn't the best. So a lot of times you want to, when you bring in like, this is 8 cards here. Sometimes you also bring in Surgical Extraction. Depending on the combo, you might also bring in Disenchant. That's a lot of different cards. Something has to get cut, and usually I find that Stoneforge Mystic package is the slowest thing, and that ends up getting cut. Against a lot of the control decks, you still bring in the Vendilion Clicks, the Counterspell, the Snapcaster Mage, and the Thoughtseize, but you don't usually bring in the Force of Wills because those matchups are a little bit more grindy and attrition based, and you don't want the 2-for-1 that Force of Will provides. So that's why you would leave this one on the bench, but you still would want these cards for the disruption aspect. Surgical Extraction is for a variety of different decks, namely like the number one deck is Dredge, which has fallen a lot in popularity, but it's also good against a lot of combo decks. Alongside like cards like Thoughtseize and Inquisition, you can often strip an important piece from their hand and then Surgical Extract it. So if you, against like a Show and Tell deck, if you Thoughtseize a Show and Tell and then extract their Show and Tells, they basically are going to have a very difficult time beating you. Additionally, I've had situations where, for example, against Show and Tell, I was able to Thoughtseize an Omniscience, and I had a Crocus in play, and my opponent cast Show and Tell. Now, I knew that he probably was putting in another Omniscience, or else he wouldn't just play Show and Tell into my untapped Crocus. So I was able to Surgical Extraction the Omniscience in his graveyard in response, get rid of the one in his hand, and then effectively counter his Show and Tell as a result. So there's a lot of applications for Surgical Extraction. Even against a deck like Blue-White Miracles, I like Surgical Extraction to get their Jaces, since that's the one, pretty much the main way they're going to beat you. And then Disenchant. Disenchant's just a great all-purpose card in Legacy. There's a lot of decks where you want this card. It's good against cards like Aether Vial. It's good against cards like Counterbalance. There's just like any kind of deck, if you play against something like an Enchantress deck, there's just a number of situations where you're going to want a card like Disenchant. So it's good to have access to this effect. But this is the sideboard. This is the deck. Hopefully I'll be able to show you some of the awesome things that the Deathblade deck can do. And see you at the games.